Pennsylvania Trolley Museum's Zoom series, Trolleyology. My name is Kristen Fredrickson. I'm the Assistant Manager of Visitor Experience here at the Trolley Museum. Thank you again for joining us today, and welcome back to those of you who have joined us for previous programs. This virtual series features programs on Pennsylvania transit history topics and stories about the trolley era and our collection that you can experience from the comfort of your home. And we will be continuing these programs regularly. So if you have a show you'd like to share that fits our museum mission, please let me know. That's anything about Pennsylvania, the trolley era, or cities where our streetcars come from. And some of you have reached out to me with programs that don't quite fit those guidelines. Don't worry, you are on my radar. Reach out anyway. You can see a full list of upcoming presentations on our website, patrolley.org, which I can share in the chat box in just a few minutes. And I want to extend a very special thank you to those of you who donated for tonight's program and those who have made donations through our website. We really appreciate the support for these virtual programs. It really lets us keep going, pays the Zoom subscription. So thank you very, very much. And for those of you who might be new to the Pennsylvania Trolley Museum, we were established in 1954 as the Ardent Electric Railway by a group of trolley enthusiasts called the Pittsburgh Electric Railway Club. And the museum opened to visitors a few years later, 59 years ago in 1963, and is located along the route of the trolley line between Pittsburgh and Washington, PA. You'll find almost 50 trolleys and electric railway cars here, about 20 of which operate, and about 30,000 visitors per year take the 4-mile scenic ride at the museum. The biggest news for this crowd, we have our West Penn Trolley Meet coming up June 3rd and 4th, which you can find more info about on our website, patrolley.org, which again, I'll share in the chat in just a minute or so. June 5th, we'll actually have an optional tour at Port Authority South Hills Village Rail Center. And the deadline for that is May 20th. So if you're interested in going, please sign up soon because we will need to give them a heads up of how many people are coming. And also Saturday and Sunday, June 4th and 5th, the meet coincides with our annual Anything on Wheels. We line up some photos on June 4th in the evening. We'll do an on Steve Barry and some vintage vehicles. We're going to try to do a work car theme photo shoot as well this year, so that should be very exciting. And next, the Progress Center is coming along. I think my internet just cut out. So sorry about that. Can you guys hear me?
Yeah, you're back. Oh, we lost you again. Okay, I think we're having some technical issues, so I'm going to try to jump in and see if I can get this going. Hopefully you can hear me.
All right, Rich, I'm sorry, my internet cut out, but
okay.
hopefully you are taking it away. Sorry about that, everybody. I guess we should introduce Rich. Hopefully my internet sticks. But Rich is a native Clevelander. He got his start as an intern with the Regional Transit Authority in Cleveland during university, and he has a degree in urban planning from Cleveland State University. He is a 40+ year transit professional, and his last position was Chief Operating Officer at MARTA in Atlanta. He's been involved in planning, designing, and operating new starts, including Buffalo, Dallas, Houston, Boston, and the Atlanta streetcar. And now Rich is semi-retired doing consultant work. All right, Rich. And just as a reminder, everybody, we will have a question and answer session at the end of the program. So for now, let's turn off our videos and our mics will be muted, but the chat box is open. So feel free to enter questions or answer other people's questions in the chat box. And Rich, take it away. Sorry about that.
Oh, no problem. So good evening, everybody. This has been an interesting presentation for me. Actually, it's been a couple years in the works. And originally, this was an article that I wrote for First and Fastest. And First and Fastest, for a while, those of you who get the publication may know that there was a kind of a brief period there where they expanded a little bit beyond Chicagoland. And we're looking at doing articles on the Midwest. So there was a nice group of articles that was done by Aaron Isaacson at Minneapolis area, progress on light rail construction and things like that. And I had spoken with them, and they had were interested in me doing a couple articles. One was on Shaker Rapids Pullman PCC cars, which were essentially identical to Chicago's big Pullmans, and then also this article on the PCC car in Cleveland, because there is a strong Chicago connection to what went on in the city of Cleveland related to the PCC cars on CTS. And there were two, and as you'll see through the presentation, there were two key players that were tied directly to Chicago that actually wound up having long careers in Chicago after they kind of left the Cleveland scene. So we'll kind of talk about that as we go along. So I want to preface this by saying that I was not alive during this time period. I was born in 1957, and I missed the CTS streetcar era. And as we get to the fan trip later on, which was in 1953, there's very few people left that are around that actually were on the fan trip, although I did find one guy, Bill Vigris, who apparently was on the trip and provided some good details. So we'll get into that as we go forward. Again, this is about CTS PCC cars. It's not about Shaker PCCs. Of course, Shaker's PCCs lasted into the 80s. And they were purchased a couple of years after CTS purchased their fleet. And they were, again, they were in service for a long time. However, Cleveland's experience was very brief, only 7 years. I'm not sure how many other transit properties, maybe the folks on the Zoom here can fill me in, that had a shorter period of PCC car operation that Cleveland did at 7 years. I don't count Louisville because Louisville actually never put them in revenue service. They wound up, some of the cars, but not all of them wound up going to Louisville, but they never actually operated in Louisville. So I don't count them. So it's a pretty short period of operation of PCCs. So the PCC car experience in Cleveland started back when Cleveland Railway was operating the system pre CTS, when the city took over the system. That was in 1942. And Cleveland's big private operator was Cleveland Railway, which was at one time owned by the Vans, and eventually purchased by the city of Cleveland. So there was a trial demonstration in 1938, which has a Pittsburgh connection, and we'll get to that. So Cleveland was a member of the ERPCC. Interestingly enough, they hosted the ATA conference in 1934, and all four experimental pre-PCCs, and actually the first PCC was actually in Cleveland. They actually did run them in service around a loop around downtown for folks to take a ride on it. And you know, there was some interest in what was going on with the development of the program. Again, Cleveland Railway was a member. So there was a decision in 1938 to, let's take a deeper look at the PCC car. You know, will it work in Cleveland? How will it fit in? Will it be received well by the public? And Cleveland was a very strong streetcar city at the time. there was interest in modernization of the fleet at that point. And so they really wanted to give a good test of the PCC car. So what they did was they actually borrowed Pittsburgh Railway 1095, which was in 1936, so relatively new, St. Louis built air electric PCC car. Now, of course, the gauge didn't work because the Pennsylvania gauge is larger than Cleveland ran standard gauge. So they were able to work a deal where they actually swapped trucks with Capital Transit, put them on the Pittsburgh body. They also converted the car to two-man because at that point in 1938, Cleveland was not running one-man streetcars. And apparently, I guess Pittsburgh may have. Somebody from Pittsburgh can let us know that. Because my understanding is that they added the conductor station so the car could run two-man service. They actually took the time, the effort, and the money to repaint the car into the initial Lowy paint scheme, which is shown here in the picture on the right, which at the initial paint scheme was actually shades of gray and silver. And if you could see carefully, it was kind of hard to pick up, but in the side sign, it actually says new PCC car, which I thought was pretty neat. So they ran the car all around the system to kind of get a feel for it. They promoted it. And Bob Korak had a story about how they set the land speed record on the Mayfield streetcar line, which had a big section of private right-of-way. And apparently the car achieved a speed that was never again replicated by any other streetcar. So we have some views of the car. So quickly, this obviously, these aren't PCC cars, but this gives you an idea of what the original green Raymond Loewy paint scheme looked like. They changed the paint scheme to the more scheme that folks who are around the Navy remember, Cleveland streetcars remember, which is more of a buff tan cream color, which we'll see later on. They discontinued the green Loewy scheme because they thought it had very poor nighttime visibility. So they wound up switching the paint scheme. So they actually went out and promoted the streetcar in the city. This is a brochure that my dad kept in his collection. This is the, excuse me here. So this is the inside of the brochure. I just kind of put it in the format we could see the different pieces and put in this little graphical display. But they were really promoting, this how smooth it was, swift, silent, safe. This was, I think we kind of forget because of where we are in today's world. The PCC was a significant advancement in technology for the street railway business. When people were riding on a lot of cars that had coal stoves, for instance, in Cleveland, a lot of the streetcar fleet, the older fleet had coal stoves. They had wood seats, wood slat seats, poor lighting with bare light bulbs, all those kind of things. And the PCC was really a big advancement that the industry was quite proud of. And a lot of cities were kind of clamoring to get into service. So here's a picture of 1095. This is at Public Square, nighttime shot. The car sitting on Superior Avenue. This is a picture of a car out at the Loop. It kind of kills me. The guy on the left side is wearing knickers, I guess, which back then was kind of way younger boys dress before they got long pants as men. So I thought that was kind of interesting. This is a picture of the PCC car turning into the Rocky River Loop. Which was the end of the Detroit streetcar line in Lakewood, Ohio, which was the suburb that I grew up in. Behind us, where you see those the automobiles, is actually where the Lakeshore Electric came across a bridge that's just to the left of here. They didn't come down this section, but they actually crossed the bridge kind of off to the left. My dad took this picture when he was 16 years old. Believe it or not, I've got the original jacket sleeve and the negative, and he took this picture, which is kind of hard to believe. They got a photograph my dad took when he was that young. But of course, he told me a lot of stories when I was a kid about how excited he was about riding this Pcc car. It was kind of like a rocket ship or a spaceship to a kid at that time to see something so modern inside and outside, and the different noises it made, and that it didn't sound like a standard, streetcar. You can see the seat fabric is kind of wild, kind of interesting seat fabric that Pittsburgh chose for their cars. So the demonstration was very successful. It was well received by the public, but unfortunately, Cleveland Railway just didn't have the financial resources to purchase a fleet of PCC cars back in 1938. They operated under what was called the Taylor Grant, which was an agreement that was developed to kind of consolidate the various streetcar systems at the time into one unified system, sort of a franchise agreement. And that agreement regulated the profit that Cleveland Railway could make, and it also regulated the fares that Cleveland Railway could charge. So any significant expenditures, capital, like a fleet of cars or the construction of a new operating station, those kind of things, required a lot of resources, obviously, and they were resources that I think Cleveland Railway was unwilling to invest in at the time. And then the Taylor Grant was periodically renewed. So I think that was another reason Cleveland Railway was a little hesitant to invest in a fleet of vehicles when they may not be the operator, or they may lose the Taylor Grant and it may be ordered to somebody else to operate the system. So kind of all those factors, I think money was probably the primary one. So that left, the reason we're looking at these cars, that left this fleet of cars, which were built in 1928-30, as the biggest fleet of modern vehicles. There were 150 of these. These were Coleman-built cars that roamed the system for many years into the 50s. In fact, these were the last cars that were operated in Cleveland because the PCC cars were gone by the time the last streetcar lines were gone. And of course, we also had the Super Wits. There were 28 of these cars. These are also built around the same period as the 4000s. So this basically remained the newest cars in the system until the PCC cars arrived under CTS management. So like we spoke earlier, CTS was created in 1942, took operation over the system. And at the time, the system was very robust. It was still very big. They had a large fleet of about 780 trolleys at the time, still in operation. Small bus fleet, one trackless trolley line. And there was a lot of pressure after the war about modernizing the system because, like most urban rail properties across the U.S., the phenomenal ridership burden that they carried through the war just really exhausted a lot of the physical plant and, of course, the vehicles. And there was a great anticipation after the war that there was going to be this modernization plan. And this is an editorial cartoon I found kind of expressing the frustration of CTS and the city council, which at the time was responsible for CTS. The CTS board reported to city council about, what's going on with this modernization plan. We're not seeing anything. So kind of some post-war facts on the left side here. Cleveland was the sixth largest city in the U.S. at the time. They were really an industrial giant. They had very stable ridership. Even after the advent of World War II, ridership remained robust. They were doing well. And the city was continuing to grow. The city was not in decline or anywhere near decline. In fact, it continued to grow to the point where it reached close to 1 million people in 1950. They had a very large intact streetcar network, like some of these larger cities like Philadelphia and other cities at the time. They were operating 22 car lines. They had 293 miles of track and 780 plus or minus streetcars in operation. So there was a lot of anticipation about, let's get on with this, modernization plan. You're running cars there were fleets of cars from 1914, 1915, still in operation in the system. Folks really wanted to see some movement, wanted to kind of share in the prosperity of post-World War II United States. So the general manager at the time, Walter McCarter, Reed was actually in charge of the transit board. McCarter was the general manager at the time, worked on a series of plans that eventually kind of got distilled down to this version. The idea was to retain the 17 of the heaviest streetcar lines, about 114 track miles. Let me get this out of here. So you see the west side lines on the left. The west side of Cleveland was always kind of smaller. It still is today. Even the suburban west side are smaller than the east side for some reason, just kind of the way it developed. And then the east side car lines are on the right side of the table here to show you what was intended to stay in operation. There was going to be an extensive subway system of around 100 blocks all the way from West 65th to East 65th. There was going to be a 5-station downtown loop subway. They were going to utilize a part of the Shaker Rapid right-of-way to get into the terminal. Some car lines were going to go on that. The West Side Rapid was going to have streetcars, not what it turned out to be with rapid transit. It would run over the CUT viaduct across the west side. And there were also a number of railroad lines that were going to be used for streetcar right-of-way. The idea was to really get streetcars out of the core of the major congestion in downtown and the adjoining neighborhoods, kind of like what Philadelphia did or Boston did. It would have been very familiar to that. There would have been a fleet of 275 MU-PCC cars, very extensive bus feeder network. At the time, there was only one trackless trolley line. There wasn't any thought about having a big trackless trolley system at the time. So I think everybody was pretty proud of themselves, and they've approved, the transit board approved the plan, and they forwarded it on to city council for review in 44. I forgot the 44 there. So they had a plan. They kind of knew the direction they were going, and they felt very confident. So they decided, let's start implementing the plan. Let's buy some PCC cars. So in 1946, they were able to work a deal with Pullman Standard to build the initial fleet of 50 cars, which you see here on your left. And this was a picture my dad took of the car on display, Superior, in Public Square, which is kind of the heart of it is today still the heart of service. It's where the bus lines come in today. It's where the streetcar lines came in. The streetcars were built in Worcester, Massachusetts plant. They were all electric Westinghouse. They had backup controllers, and they were all ready to go with MU, although they didn't install the couplers, all the wiring and everything, the bracketry, the harnesses, everything were ready to go. They had Clark B2 trucks, and they were a narrow width of 8.4. And you kind of see as you see these cars in revenue service on the streets. Cleveland was like Chicago in that they had very big, wide streets. They could have accommodated a car the length of what the car of the length and the width that Shaker Rapid ran. No problem on the streets of Cleveland. There may have been a few pinch points on the west side, but primarily they could have run a much larger car. They chose not to. They were hedging their bet. I think this was McCarter's idea, that in case things went south with the streetcar system, well, there's a lot more systems that can run the narrower PCC car than can run a wide car like Chicago or Shaker did. So that was the reason to go with the narrower car. Much to Shaker's chagrin, Shaker was upset about that because they saw the operation, their operation running in the same subway, the CTS. They were at one time fairly enthused about getting a better way into the city than going down the CUT right away, having some additional stops on the way to the terminal, and having standard with cars would have made a lot more sense. So I think in the long run, that was something that kind of turned off Shaker to the whole downtown subway proposal. Interesting at the time, the Office of Defense Transportation was still around, even though the war was essentially over. And transit agencies still had to go to them to ask for the purchase of new transit vehicles, buses, trackless trolleys, and streetcars. And apparently they were pretty enthusiastic about Cleveland dipping their toes into Pcc car market and modernizing their system. So they got a lot of support. This is another picture of a car on display when it was brand new. You can see an older streetcar running behind it and the bus kind of crossing over behind it. This is on Superior Avenue, Public Square. And I just threw some pictures of the cars in revenue service that I thought were kind of neat. So this is a nice nighttime shot my dad took downtown Cleveland next to the courthouse. There are some color pictures of Cleveland PCC cars around, but not a whole lot of them apparently. They're tough to find. I've been able to get some off of eBay over the years. This is one that I purchased off of eBay. This is Public Square downtown. And this is 4200, which was the first PCC car. Here we see a car coming into Brooklyn Station, which is at the end of the West 25th line. I think we discussed this before in my previous presentation. Some of you may have seen it about Cleveland in the transition years, but Cleveland, like a number of cities, is kind of geographically divided. There's East Siders and there's West Siders, and the Cuyahoga River kind of splits the city into two. And the public square is the center of town, and then streets are numbered from Public Square either to the east or to the west. So there's a geographic divide in the city of Cleveland, still remains so, and there's probably, some would say, a cultural divide as well between West Siders and East Siders. So there was not an initial plan to put PCC cars on the west side. But when they deployed them on the east side lines, mostly St. Clair and Superior, they were incredibly popular. And city council members really got upset because their constituents were not able to enjoy the same benefit of having these wonderful modern cars on the west side lines. So Carter knew that he had to scrape up together some additional funds and try to buy some additional PCC cars quickly. And Louisville presented an opportunity that was hard for CTS to turn down because they ordered a fleet of cars, PCC cars. And as they were delivering the cars in that interim period of construction delivery, Louisville decided they were going to get out of the streetcar business. And so they were looking for a home for, brand new streetcars that actually never turned a wheel on their own city streets. So CTS was able to work a deal with Louisville to swap for 25 brand new General Motors buses and cash, and they were able to buy 25 of the cars. These were St. Louis cars. They did have Westinghouse controls like the Pullman cars did. They were not MU capable, although Toronto converted them in the future. We'll kind of take a look at that. And they had no backup controls. The problem with operating on the west side car lines in Cleveland, which is the West 25th, which had 3 branches associated with it, is that to operate around Brooklyn Station, which was the station that served the lines, you needed to do a lot of backup moves to get in and out of the station. And so although these cars were purchased, so they could spread PCC cars around the city, these Louisville cars, I don't think ever really made it over to the west side that I know of. They were in the process of being delivered when CTS purchased them. In fact, 15 cars were shipped directly to CTS and never actually made it to Louisville. The cars were converted to Cleveland configuration by Cleveland's own shop forces. These cars were really the most liked by the maintenance and the operating of the 2 PCC fleets, the St. Louis cars. These were the ones that were most liked. Shaker actually took the first look at purchasing these cars before CTS. They kind of got them the jump on them at the time. But again, because of the narrow width They had 2-1 seating, and Shaker really wanted the wider car so they could have 2-2 seating because their scheduling was based on basically seated loads. Being more of a commuter-based operation, Shaker was, than a streetcar urban operation. So they rejected them, and CTS went up with them. So this is an interior of a Louisville, St. Louis car. My dad went to the car house where these cars were converted and took a bunch of pictures of them when they were brand new. That's where this, or brand new to CTS. This is where this picture and this slide before was taken at the same car house. This was taken the same day. And a couple pictures of cars and revenue service. We have a couple color photos. Again, these are kind of rare to come on. You can see how wide the street is here. Cleveland streets are kind of typical of this width. This is another car on St. Clair. The cars were initially put on St. Clair and Superior, which were two big, heavy car lines in Cleveland. Here's another picture. Again, you can see how wide these streets are. This car is on Superior making a turn. Another picture on Superior. And interestingly enough, the tire store in the background there, you see Walter J. Mueller Tires. That company is still in existence. It's not in this location any longer, but the company still survives and still sells tires. Right behind it is, behind the PCC car, you see a Brinks truck going to a building that's a Brinks building where they transferred cash and armored cars came in. I believe that's still there. At least the building is still there for sure. Kind of interesting. So kind of a summary of the PCC car fleet operation. It really was a small fleet. When you think about having 780 cars, having 75 PCCs was a very small subfleet. They only operated on 6 of the 20 remaining lines when they were delivered in 1946. St. Clair, Superior, and West 25th, which had 3 branches, were really the mainstays for the cars. They had a short lifespan on Clark Avenue and Denison on the west side, which was my old neighborhood. They were withdrawn from those lines because a Denison Station at the time apparently was not capable of maintaining the cars. And again, when you think about the technology, you think about, you know, a propulsion system for a PCC car, you know, bases, you know, and you look at an old streetcar with switch resistance, you know, propulsion and air brakes, and, you know, big difference. So these guys apparently at Denison Station were not capable of maintaining these vehicles, and so CTS reassigned them to a couple other lines. They also operated on 55th Street, and we'll get into that when the railfan trip, when we go through the railfan trip. Oddly enough, the cars never operated on Euclid Avenue, which was the heaviest car line. You know, I don't know why they didn't. I haven't been able to get a decent answer from anybody. I mean, the 75 cars was probably not, it would have taken all the PCC cars and then some to operate Euclid Avenue because it had a huge car requirement. Very heavy line. It was running 90-second headways when I was a traffic checker in the early 80s, so it was a very heavy line. So really, there were never enough cars, even on St. Clair or Superior or 25th, to completely replace conventional equipment. So they were always supplemented, particularly during peak hours, with conventional streetcars and trailer trains as well, which Cleveland was big on running trailer trains. But for a small fleet, they had a really big impact on the system because people really loved them. You know, they had a survey where they surveyed trackless trolleys, buses, and PCC cars to riders, and the PCCs won overwhelmingly. People loved the cars. The operators loved the cars because they were so comfortable to operate. Of course, the maintenance guys had to get up to speed, and some did. And obviously, Denison Station didn't. So, you know, we had the plan back in 1944. This is kind of a chronology of events, and this is where things take a turn. They take a twist, kind of unanticipated, I think, by a lot of people. Because they thought they had a decent plan. The Reed-McCarter plan, you know, was a good plan. It kept the core lines. It built extensive subway, getting by the most congested parts of the city. It significantly improved run times of streetcar lines. I saw a list of comparison of run times between the Reed-McCarter plan and the existing pre-subway operation. It was pretty impressive. But when the Transit Board forwarded the plan to City Council for approval, they didn't approve it. They decided they wanted to study it. So this is kind of where your Chicago connection comes in. So the City Council decided to retain Charles DeLue, who eventually became DeLue Cather, as consultant in 1945. Why they chose DeLue, I really have no idea. I tried to do some research. I don't know what the connection was. There were other consulting firms that were prominent in the transit business back in those days. So I really don't understand what that connection was about. And then, not too long after he's hired, he recommends a brand new rapid transit plan in October 1945. And the crux of that plan is the total elimination of streetcars. So in his study and his estimation, which still kind of astounds me looking at ridership, his determination was there was not sufficient ridership at any existing streetcar lines, including Euclid Avenue, Superior, St. Clair, West 25th, to continue with streetcar operations. He just thought surface transit vehicles should be rubber tired. There was just no need to retain streetcars. So the Rapid Transit Plan was approved by the City Council in May 1946. And oddly enough, the first PCC cars hit the streets in August of 1946. So by the time the first PCC cars arrived, the writing was on the wall that the whole entire streetcar system was on its way out. So, I'm not really sure, and I kind of went through this in the article they wrote for First and Fastest. I'm not quite sure if City Council was lobbied by folks. I've heard stories from my dad, my uncle, and others that, the business community, some of the City Council members, a lot of, and this was across the United States at the time, they thought streetcars were old, they were ancient, modern cities didn't have streetcars, the bus was the way to go. So not certain what lobbying went on behind the scenes, because the plan that Reed-McCarter put together was actually not only effective, but it was quite affordable, considering the scope of the plan, the length of the subway, and the service it would have provided. It was very competitive with just the one line rapid transit line that Cleveland wound up building. So McCarter resigned in 1947, not too long after the rapid transit plan was approved by City Council. He was, previous to that, a strong streetcar supporter. But oddly enough, when PCC cars went into operation in 1946, he said he thought he was not that impressed by them compared to new rubber tired buses, and thought that Cleveland probably had made the right decision in the long run. So the story, the plot thickens, because eventually McCarter winds up, he did a short stint in New York State at a small property, wound up as a consultant working for DeLue, and then became the first general manager of CTA, which of course got rid of streetcars. And the guy that did a lot of those studies for what to do with the modernization plan for surface operation in Chicago was Charles DeLue. So I don't know, coincidence maybe. It just kind of makes you wonder, like how all this stuff transpired, and how all this happened. But McCarter had a very successful career with CTA. One thing that DeLue was a big proponent of was he didn't see urban freeways, which were being built at the time, as being something that could not coexist with rail transit. So you see the Dan Ryan Expressway and other implementations in Chicago of rapid transit being built into highway projects. So I think he saw the benefit of that, but had very little interest in retaining the surface operation. But at the time in Chicago, the surface operation, which had a large PCC car fleet, actually carried a lot more people, much heavier ridership than the old L system did at the time. So just kind of interesting how things transpired in Chicago. We could do a whole nother presentation on that. So knowing that the stage was set to the eventual elimination of the streetcar system, Cleveland started purchasing big fleets of rubber-tired vehicles, including trackless trolleys. And they were actually went up to over 600 trackless trolleys. They were a big trackless trolley operator until 1963. So the lines, many of the lines that were intended to be retained, the 17 of the heaviest lines that converted to Pcc car operation, I think about 14 of those or so, actually were converted to trackless trolley lines, not to bus lines. So even though they had a rapid transit plan approved in 46, there was no money to actually build it. So they had to continue with the streetcar operation, of course, eventually abandoning lines line by line. There was massive abandonments that occurred in 48, kind of through that period. And then eventually financing for the rapid was received in 1951 by the federal government through the RFC program. The last PCC car fan trip, which we're going to get into later, was March 8th of 1953. All PCC cars were off the property by 1953, and they went to Toronto Transit Commission. So the streetcar service actually ended in Cleveland with older cars. So streetcar service ended in 1954 in the Madison Avenue car line, and then not very long afterwards, the East Side Rapid Transit opened March 15th, 1955. So really kind of, yeah, within months of each other, you saw streetcars go, the Rapid Transit start, and then the West Side came on in 1955. So the picture on the right is actually a test train, probably around June, July 1955, because the West Side came in just after the East Side Rapid did. It's coming off the C&T viaduct. You can see the terminal tower kind of hazy in the background there. So the new era for rapid transit began. So knowing that PCC cars were going and the whole streetcar system was going to be dismantled, the Cleveland Railroad Club, which was kind of the preeminent railroad club in Cleveland at the time, which I understand no longer exists. I think they were merged in with the Akron Railroad Club maybe 3 or 4 years ago, something like that. They decided to have a farewell charter with the PCC cars. So what you see here is actually souvenir tickets that my dad saved. So they decided they would travel on 5 streetcar lines, and they would visit 5 stations, but actually they want to visit 6 because they added Superior as well. So for $1.50, you can enjoy a long day of riding streetcars all over the Cleveland system. So they attempted to pick routes some that never ran streetcars and some that had just quit running cars, but the track and wire was still up and available for them to run on. So as we go through the presentation, we'll see some pretty rare footage. It was really interesting for me to put this presentation together, and what really helped me was, we'll kind of get through this in a minute, there was a newspaper article done about this fan trip in Cleveland newspaper, and years ago they used to have reporters who covered the transit beat, believe it or not. When I first came to Dallas in 1985, there was still an active transit reporter that covered the transit beat. I don't think a lot of cities, except maybe New York or Boston, have anybody who covers the transit beat anymore. But this was significant enough for them to send people out to take pictures and do a brief article that went into the newspaper. So here you see the part of the group of fans that went on the trip. So the person standing in the front here with the trench coat on and the hat and holding the big speed graphic is my father. So he was on the trip. And I really was, I had photos that he had taken on this PCC charter. And in subsequent years, I got photos from a guy named Jim Spangler, who was a big time Cleveland rail fan, a contemporary of my father and the other guys at the time. And I started looking at those two groups of pictures, and I thought there was really enough here for really a great presentation. The problem was I didn't know what sequence the trip was operated in, what specific car lines they went across. It was kind of difficult to figure all this out, but I also found out my dad saved in the same envelope with the photographs. He saved this description by this reporter of the sequence of operation of the trip and which car lines they went to and what order they ran the trip in. So that helped. But because they were, like a lot of fan trips that you all probably been on, they put these goofy destination signs up for car lines that these cars never ran on or never ran on, or that they hadn't run on for 30 years. And they also operated these PCC cars on lines that they had never operated these cars on before. And I remember my dad telling me that there were definitely issues as they were going through junctions, switches, in some of these areas, because they hadn't been used in a long time. So they had to dig the switches out. The PCCs, operated a little different than the standard equipment did. The trolley pole setup was a little different, so they had the wirements here and there. The PCC car wheels, the flanges, and the treads, of course, being pretty new and not as worn out as the older equipment. They had some issues here and there where they actually ran up on top of some cobblestones and things like that. So kind of interesting trip. So between this article and the photographs and Google Maps, I was able to basically figure out the sequence of cars and sequence of the pictures and how this stuff kind of fit together. So for some of these, I was looking at street signs, street addresses. I might know the street, but I didn't know specifically where in the street it was. But between Google Earth, this, and also discussions with Dennis Lamont and Bill Vigers, who are Cleveland rail fans, they're kind of up in their years, had been around for a while. They knew the system obviously much better than I did because I wasn't even around during Cleveland Streetcar operation. I think I pretty much figured it out. And if I didn't, I'm not sure there's anybody who would know the difference anyway. So I feel pretty comfortable that I won't be challenged. But feel free to challenge me if you want to challenge me as we go forward. So the first trip was to go down the West 25th Street car line to Brooklyn Station. At that time, the trip was operating in 1953. The Pearl Road branch was bussed in 1947, and the Broadview branch of the West 25th Street car line was bussed in 1950. So State Road was the only part of the West 25th Street streetcar line which still had streetcars. So the first picture here is at the very beginning of our trip. And we're right in front of Cleveland Union Terminal. You can see the terminal facade in the background, and the clock up there at the top. Nice fleet of new buses parked there. This is in March, so you'll see as we go through, it's fairly cold in March in Cleveland, particularly early March in Cleveland. So we're kind of rounding the loop here. We're digging out some switches that probably haven't been used for a while. You can see the fans over to the left with their cameras, getting ready for the trip. We're on, the cars come around the loop now. We're on Superior, getting ready to head out. And then we go down Superior, actually in the opposite direction of this car. Underneath what Clevelanders called the subway, which was the lower deck of the Detroit Superior Bridge. This was a 4-track subway. So car lines were separated by side of operation, depending on where they were going to when they got across to the west side of the bridge. And some of them peeled off to one portal, and then there was another portal on Detroit Avenue where other car lines went. And so my first confusion was, this car is on the wrong side of the 4-track subway under the bridge, because the West 25th State Road cars wouldn't be here. But that's the reason why, because they decided not to run down the normal state road route, West 25th Street State Road route, but instead they use the Detroit portal. You can kind of see behind the streetcar downtown Terminal Tower, very kind of vaguely up in the corner over here. But they use the Detroit portal to run this trip, which eventually wandered its way over to West 25th Street and down the State Road and Brooklyn Station. So this really confused the heck out of me for a long time until I kind of pieced it together, because they wanted to wind up over in this Franklin Circle area. Now these PCC cars never ran here. This was no revenue service here. They may have tested them, I'm not sure. They definitely never ran a revenue service here. And they wanted to go to Franklin Circle. So there was this circuitous routing that they had to take to get over to Franklin Circle, which is kind of the photogenic location, a non-PCC car operation area, which was probably a big part of its attraction. So they kind of wound their way over here. So we're headed over to Franklin Circle here. There was a stop here for a photo shoot. Most of this neighborhood is still intact, which kind of surprising. Most of these buildings are still here. Some of them have been renovated and converted into condominiums, townhouses. I think it's still a fairly decent neighborhood. So now we're coming off of 28th and we're turning onto Franklin. And again, you know, a lot of these switches hadn't been used. These junctions hadn't been used on a regular basis, routine basis for a number of years for some of these cars. And again, it's a PCC car. So you'll see in some of these pictures, you know, supervisors on the ground, watching the trolley pole, watching the track, you know, making sure everything's okay. So now we swing over onto Franklin Boulevard. This is West 28th Street in Franklin. The car is heading back towards West 25th Street, making this circuitous loop to get back on West 25th Street and then head southbound to Brooklyn Station. So the church on the left is still there. And as you can see, it's snowing. It's early March in Cleveland. It snows. And you can see trolley bus wire up there. A lot of these lines, again, had already been converted to trolleybus operation before this fan trip occurred. So now we're heading down Franklin Boulevard towards West 25th Street. We're going to turn right on West 25th Street. On the right side here is Lutheran Hospital, which is dear to me because there was a blessed event that occurred there in 1957, which was in August, which was when I was born. I was actually born in this hospital right here. And it's still there, and it's part of Cleveland Clinic now. So now we're coming down West 25th Street. This was really hard for me to figure out where all this was because the construction of the I-71 freeway just obliterated, you know, big parts, like in a lot of major urban areas, just really obliterated parts of the neighborhoods. And I could make out some of the street signs, like on the left there, Poe. But that street's not even there anymore. Poe is there, but it exists further down. They kind of demoed this whole area for ramps and everything to get on the freeway. So this was one of the pictures that probably took me the longest to figure out exactly where the heck this thing was. So we're heading down to Brooklyn Station. So this is Brooklyn Station, which was the end of the West 25th State Road car line. This is kind of an interesting story on these aerial pictures because you may wonder, how did this guy get aerial pictures of streetcar barns and transit stations in the 50s? Well, the interesting part of that is my dad, after World War II, my dad was actually a professional photographer for half of his career, and which is a long story, but he worked for NASA, which at the time was the NACA, National Aeronautics Civil Administration, which became NASA shortly after he started work. And he was a flight research photographer for NASA. And they did a lot of testing with high altitude icing of wing surfaces and engines and all that. But when they were preparing to do a lot of these flights, having an airplane available and a great camera, he had the guys, the flight crews, fly over at the top of these different streetcar stations that were still in existence in the early 50s. So this is an aerial view of Brooklyn Station. You can see at the time, it's really, at this point in time, it's really populated by buses. And you don't see a lot of streetcars. So there's still tracks here, there's still wire here. And Brooklyn Station stayed in operation as a bus facility for many, many years. This is in a section of suburban area of Cleveland called, I think this is in Parma at this point. So here's some kind of, these are ground level pictures of Brooklyn Station. You can see these are the older Coleman 4000 series cars at Brooklyn Station. You can see kind of the stub end tracks. The towers you see kind of between the tracks that have a ladder going up to the top of them. On the top of those are actually fire nozzle hose. And Cleveland Railway built their new stations with fire suppression systems like that. And they went back and converted a lot of their old facilities with these fire stations because a lot of fire suppression systems, because a lot of these streetcar systems had horrible experience with streetcar barns, just burning to the ground. Recent example being Philadelphia at Woodhill. And so Cleveland Railway, which built most of these stations, or all these stations, decided they weren't going to lose vehicles by fire. So the new stations are all brick, no wood, and the stations were equipped with fire suppression systems. So here's the older fleet cars. Here's a picture with PCC cars at the same station, buses on the right side. We see a Bernie and a sweeper. Cleveland had one, two, maybe two Bernies. They were used as rail grinders. They were never used in revenue service. I don't think they ever had any car lines that probably would have had ridership that low that they could have used them on any kind of regular basis. So then they made their way over to Denison Station from Brooklyn Station, which was another project in itself, trying to figure out the routing. Because I had an old system map from the 40s from Cleveland Railway, the late 30s, early 40s. And it showed all the streetcar routes. And the numbers, of course, when I worked as a traffic checker, the bus lines were still using the same numbers as the streetcar lines did, and primarily the same routes that the streetcars ran on. So coming back northbound on West 25th Street, it was hard for me to figure out where exactly could they have turned off to head over to Denison Station. And I looked at a series of photographs I had at pretty much every major street that ran into West 25th Street that was going east and west. And I really couldn't see where the track connections were. And it was really hard for me to figure out what this was. So I think I got it right, because I'm looking at the trolley pole up in the wire and I see it's coming off what is apparently West 25th. I can see it's transitioning over. So I believe this is at Franklin and West 25th, and they're going to head over to Denison Station. Another kind of circuitous non-PCC car route. So now we're going back down Franklin. You can see the snow is flying. We're going past Lutheran Hospital again. And we're heading, this is actually Clark and 65th. So there was a major east-west, or actually north-south crosstown car line, West 65th Street, that a lot of these east-west streetcar lines crossed on 65th Street. So there were a lot of junctions and connections to go from car line to car line, either half grand unions or full grand unions. So there was a lot of routing options in this area to get over to Denison Station. So in this picture, I noticed in the background, you can see POC, which was Pilsner of Cleveland Brewery. Actually started in the late 1800s and was really kind of famous in Cleveland. It was actually, Clevelanders called it Pride of Cleveland rather than Pilsner of Cleveland. You see advertising signs all over buses and streetcars, a POC beer. And so there's a picture of the car getting ready to go past the brewery. just for nostalgia's sake, I found this on the internet, which was the label off the beer bottles. And these are some, they had about 300 employees at their height. I'm sure these were very reliable streetcar riders, provided some good ridership to Cleveland Railway and CTS. Oddly enough, a Pittsburgh connection, this company was sold to Duquesne Brewing in Pittsburgh in the 60s. And they promptly shut the whole thing down when they bought it. But in turn, they went out of business in 1973, and Schmidt's Brewery brought the brand back to Cleveland, not at the same brewery here, but they quit brewing it in 1984. So there's a Pittsburgh connection for a Cleveland brewery. So now there was a connection between West 65th Street streetcar line down West 73rd to connect to the Denison Fulton streetcar line, which at this time was converted to trolley buses. You can see the trolley bus wire up on the top. So this car is going across the Cleveland, the CUT right-of-way is below this car. This is at Ridge and Fulton. And the car's getting ready to turn into the car barn. You can see the supervisor kind of looking up in the trolley wire, making sure everything's okay. These cars never operated over here. They didn't go into Denison. Well, there was a short period of time where they operated, but then again, the crews at Denison couldn't maintain the car. So that was very brief. I don't think it even lasted a year, but they weren't in there at this time. So we see what is underneath the bridge. What is underneath this bridge? It's the CUT, and we see a picture here that my dad took at West 73rd. The bridge is just in front of this locomotive. So that's what it looked like underneath the bridge. So here's another great aerial view of Denison Station. And you can see all brick construction, nice transportation building, trolley bays. And at the time, you can see the big fleet of trackless trolleys here, because this was converted already to trackless trolley operation. But there's a big line of sweepers. If you look in the very bottom kind of center, you can see a big line of snow sweepers lined up. You can see a bunch of 4000s and other older series cars kind of hanging around in the facility. So this was a neat aerial shot. You can see Cleveland Union Terminal right away running at the very top, left to right. So they decided to stop and take a shot of the group at Denison Station. This was another one that was kind of difficult for me to figure out, because the sign says Superior on it, but that's where they were going when they left Denison Station over to Superior. So that's why they had the destination sign rung up the way they did. And there's a bunch of prominent Cleveland rail fans that are in this picture: Bob Latt, Gene Schmidt, John Gatiss, and other folks that were pretty prominent Cleveland rail fans at the time. Willis McCaleb is over to the left of the supervisor. He was a photographer for the Nickel Plate Railroad Company photographer. There's 3 or 4 books of his photography that Morning Sun did that are really wonderful color albums of nickel plate photography that he took. So now we're going to head back over to Public Square to get over to Superior. So we see a standard 4000 car. To our left, the tower in the back is the West Side Market. Like a lot of cities years ago, they had market houses because grocery stores really weren't that available. So you went down to the market house to buy your meat and your poultry and your vegetables. And that actually is the West Side Market is still actually there. It's still operating. It's a neat place to go to. My dad told me when he was a kid, he used to come down here with my grandmother to go shopping. And of course, he stayed outside so he could watch all the streetcar action while she was picking through the tomatoes and cucumbers and everything in the West Side Market. So now we're swinging back onto 25th Street, and we're getting ready to take a trip back to the West Side, but this time we're going to go on the Madison Avenue car line. So we're coming up out of the portal. This is the West 25th Street portal. Franklin Boulevard is in front of us this time. And we're going to head our way over to get onto the Madison streetcar line. Now, Madison was a line that never had any PCC cars in revenue service. So this was quite a delight for rail fans. And I'm sure it was an oddity for people living in the neighborhood to see these cars coming through, because I'm sure they would have loved to have PCC car service on the Madison line into Lakewood. They never got it. And they had a ragtag fleet of some fairly old cars running on service in Lakewood on the Detroit and Madison Avenue car line. So now we're going down bridge, heading our way over to the Madison Avenue, the car and the bus route ran pretty much in the same route, kind of took some twists and turns before it actually wound up on Madison. And this car is swinging off 65th Street onto the Madison car line. This was another one that was hard to figure out, but the building is still there, and it has that kind of diagonal shape to it. It's a different, it isn't Tasty, or whatever the name of this thing was, but it's still there. So I was able to tell from Google, looking at aerial, looking down on the intersection here, I could definitely see the outline, diagonal shape of that corner of the building, and I kind of knew where we were at from there. So now we're coming down Madison. We're getting close to getting into Lakewood, which is the suburb where I grew up, my second neighborhood of Cleveland. The neat thing with this picture is you see where the gentleman is standing on top of the bridge. That is where the West Side Rapid eventually operated. So not too long after this trip, a year and a half or so, or two, if we were here, we would see rapid transit trains going across the top of us. So this is kind of a neat S-curve. And then we wound up at Madison Station. Again, PCC cars never saw the light of day in Madison Station. Madison already had trackless trolleys operating out of Madison. You see some 4000s that were still operating on Madison Avenue back at this time. And the Madison Station is actually kind of on the border. West 117th Street is the border between the city of Cleveland and the city of Lakewood. And his car house was kind of right on the border. So we'll kind of see a sequence of photos of the car operating around through the back of the car house, and now poking its way to the front of the car house. And we see the Superior sign again there, which must have been a real oddity for people living in the neighborhood to see a car sign for Superior. And it's actually a short turn car because it says East 9th on it. And that band of color underneath where it says East 9th was orange. If you saw orange on a Cleveland streetcar and destination sign, that meant it was a short turn car. It was not running the full length of the route. So it's getting ready to poke its nose out here. You can see this is a fairly old car house. It says Cleveland City Railway up in above the door there. And this, the elimination of the station and the building of a new bus garage on Triscuit, which coincided with the West Side Rapid Station at Triscuit when they extended the Rapid from 117. They built a new bus garage. They closed this garage, and that was the reason or the excuse or the logic behind getting rid of trackless trolleys in Cleveland, because there was just no way they were going to build all the wire and the substation facilities and everything that would be needed to get the trackless trolleys that were running out of this station over to the new bus garage, which was probably 2.5, 3 miles or so, probably away from where this location was. So that was the death knell for trackless trolleys, was when this barn was torn down. So now we're going to head back to Public Square. We got our Superior sign up. We're headed eastbound on the lower deck of the subway, the Detroit Superior Bridge. Again, this is 4 tracks, so off to the right side of this are another 2 tracks or a set of car lines that went over to the east. So our next trip was, excuse me, next car line was over to East 55th. And oddly enough, and I just found this out fairly recently, The day of this fan trip was the last day that streetcars ever ran on East 55th Street. So East 55th Street was a crosstown line, very heavy crosstown line. And I had read something a while back saying that 55th Street car line in Cleveland was one of the most expensive lines to build across the US, because there were about, I think, 12 or so streetcar lines. This was a north-south line. There were about 12 lines that crossed this thing going east-west. And so you had all kinds of junctions and turnouts and grand unions and half grand unions, and pretty expensive line to build and maintain to keep in service. So right behind this PCC car, you see a brand new GM bus, one of 50 buses that were purchased to convert this line. To the right of this, where you see the bridge going over the top, was one of the original freeways, urban freeways built into the city of Cleveland. The switch arrangement in front of the streetcar really kills me. It's really unique to have that curve in there, which I guess they needed to get to swing into the loop. Excuse me. So these are pictures going around the Shard Loop, which was a short-term loop on the East 55th Street car line. You see all the rail fans out here with their cameras taking shots. And then we're going to get ready to depart. And we're going to head over with a lot of smiling faces who I think are nice and warm inside the streetcar. We're going to head over to the east side lines, the heavy east side lines, Superior and St. Clair. So by the time the streetcar, this fan trip went down St. Clair, again, I found this out not that long ago, streetcar service was already gone at St. Clair, and it was converted to trackless trolleys. And 12 days after the fan trip ran across Superior, on March 20th, and this trip was on March 12th, or excuse me, March 8th, that streetcar line was gone too. So kind of a last hurrah for the streetcar lines. So we start back down in Public Square. This is where the Superior cars turned around, looped around to get back down Superior. This is the federal courthouse on the right. Here we see Superior Station, which is, filled full of buses at this time, although we do see at the top the PCC car. So there were two stations in Cleveland where revenue service cars actually kind of clipped corners diagonally through intersections and actually operated the revenue service through a car house. And so this was one of them. So I kind of threw this picture in here. This is actually a Superior car. This is a ex-Louisville car operating through the car house as part of its normal revenue service routine. It's kind of interesting that they did that. And of course, at Superior, we see a brand new 1952 or so trolley coach. There was a whole lineup of these at Superior that were fairly new. And oddly enough, I just purchased a picture off of eBay, which Bill Vigers took, of the same series of buses. And this is in 1963, and this is the last day trackless trolley operation in Cleveland. This bus actually wound up getting purchased by a fan group operating in Chicago, on Chicago streets when Chicago had trolley buses operating a couple charters, and now is at the IRM museum, and I believe is operation. This is a picture of St. Clair Station. Lots of streetcars around. You see big long lines of PCC cars. So that's a neat aerial shot of that station, which I guess Superior they weren't supposed to visit, but they did wind up going. So this is towards the end of the fan trip. We're on Superior, kind of doing our last photo lineup before the end of the fan trip. And this was another one I had a heck of a time figuring out what the building was back there, although I did have an address. And I found out the reason I couldn't identify the building was because it looks like this right now. So You kind of see the courthouse and all that towards your left. This brand new big building. This was built by BP years ago and is now has been sold and is under other ownership. But that changed the street scene in downtown Cleveland for sure. So the PCC era grinds to an end and a farewell. And of course, the cars were sold to Toronto Transit Commission. So I've got some shots at Harvard Yard. Harvard Yard was the big overhaul facility, main shops for Cleveland Railway. CTS obviously inherited when they bought the system. They had phenomenal capabilities here. Basically, they could build, I think they built a series of trailers and other cars here. They had a foundry here, you know, kind of like the big shops of the old streetcar days where they could pretty much do anything. Rewind motors, work on air compressors, repaint, rebuild, you know, just pretty unbelievable shop. So you can see this is a car to the right's going on a ramp to get on a flat car. This is a car on a flat car, getting ready to go. Here's a car on the flat car at Harvard, getting ready to go over to the interchange with the railroad, freight railroad. And we see a picture here of a PCC car in Pennsylvania Railroad Yards, getting ready to go to Toronto. So goodbye to PCC cars in Cleveland, a very short-lived 7 years of service for really a beautiful fleet of cars. So they did find a new home in Toronto. Here's the cars in 1953 as they've been delivered to Toronto, sitting in, this is at Hillcrest shop. Hillcrest was still is like the main shop for the whole TTC system. They do a lot of rebuilding here, a lot of heavy repair work on streetcars and buses here, I guess now in Toronto at Hillcrest. So this is a shot of Cleveland Pullman PCC car in its Cleveland configuration, and then we see not the same car. This is not the identical car, but a very car similar to this, not the identical number, that has been modified for operation in Toronto. So you can see the couplers are on the car. They put the standard Toronto green light above the destination sign of the car, which I think even their new cars still have that. So when you look down the street, you know whether it's a bus or a streetcar coming towards you by the color of that light over the roof. And they put a handrail between the center doors to facilitate boarding and alighting. The cars saw really extensive service in Toronto. That they definitely got their money's worth out of their cars. You know, of course, everybody knows they bought used PCC cars from Cincinnati, Birmingham, all over the place, Kansas City. The loss of those cities was the big gain for Toronto. So here we see this is a St. Louis Louisville car in revenue service. Pictures that my dad took in the early 50s. Here's a Pullman Standard PCC car with the couplers installed. A lot of folks don't realize, not in my experience with going to TTC, which I started back in the 60s, but TTC before Yonge Street Subway and the other subway lines ran a lot of trains of PCC cars, two-car trains. PCCs was very, pretty familiar sight within Toronto. And here we see at a car barn, we see two Louisville cars. They actually converted the Louisvilles to the St. Louis Louisville cars to multiple unit operation too. So eventually cars came back to Cleveland. Back in 1979, Cleveland was having a real shortage of equipment due to the energy crisis, and was really scraping around to find cars. They even took the two Illinois terminal cars out of museums and rehabbed them and put them into service because they were really dying for equipment. So they brought 9 PCC cars. They purchased 9 PCC cars from Toronto, brought them back to Cleveland, put them in revenue service. They were in revenue service for a very short lifespan because the cars were just in horrible shape from salt on the streets in Toronto. The car bodies were really pretty rotten. And a couple of them had really serious damage, so they withdrew the whole fleet from service after a year or two. But they made great charter trains. You know, fans really love taking these things out on charter. So, you know, it's funny because Shaker rejected these cars because of their narrow width when they were offered to them before TTC bought them. And they rejected them, but they wound up going back to Shaker many, many years later and put into revenue service and experienced the same problem because the platforms weren't really set up for a car this narrow. So passengers were complaining, operators didn't like them, they were in bad shape. The maintenance guys had a hell of a time maintaining them. So they saw a very short lifespan in Cleveland. They spent most of their time at the new Central Rail facility in East 55th, which was built to handle both light rail and heavy rail. And they were in a big long line sitting there for many, many, many years before they went to a number of different museums. So 4223, which was the PCC car on the charter trip, the last PCC car fan trip, actually did make its way back as one of the 9 cars back to Cleveland to run on Shaker. So the afterlife is 4223, which was the fan trip car, resides at Illinois Railway Museum, is being restored. And I'm not sure, talking to them, whether they realized that the car they purchased was actually the car that was on the last PCC car fan trip. I'm not sure they were aware of that. So it's kind of neat to know that the car that we have all those pictures of in the fan trip still exists and it's being restored. There's 2 Pullmans that were converted to work cars that are at the Halton County Radial. They still operate them. Northern Ohio Rail Museum has one. And no Louisville cars were saved. No St. Louis Louisville cars were saved. So sad to say they didn't make it. So this is a picture of 4223, our fan trip car, at the Illinois Railway Museum under restoration. So Alex Burchak, who's very active at PTM, and myself helped get the paint scheme and the colors mixed up to get the right paint on these cars. And again, it's just a very complicated paint scheme. It's probably the most complicated PCC paint scheme there ever was. And this was based on the Raymond Loewy scheme. So this car's around, which is, it's really neat to see. It's advanced even further this in its restoration. The article I wrote for First and Fastest is going to wind up going into Illinois Railway Museum's newsletter. And they're waiting to put it in until they can pull the car back out and take really good shots of its current state of restoration, which is further advanced than this. So one is around, the car still exists, which is really cool. So I wanted to give special thanks to a number of people, including my dad, Jim Spangler, Dennis Lamont, Bill Vigers, were very helpful with the picture locations and kind of filling me in on different information. Blaine Hayes and Jim Tillman wrote the 2-volume set on streetcars in Cleveland, or Cleveland Transit, because there's buses and trolley buses in there. Bob Korek, who told me a lot of stories over the years about, he was actually in charge of schedules for CTS and assigned PCC cars at different routes and knew all about the routings and what happened. And then also my uncle, Arnold Bushnell. So that's the end of my presentation. I hope you enjoyed it.
Thank you, Rich. That was awesome. If you have any questions for Rich, you go ahead and type them in now, or in just a minute, I will let everybody unmute themselves and share. But I just wanted to let everybody know what's coming up here virtually at the museum. We have a presentation on Port Authority's electric bus initiative coming up May 24th. And on May 31st, just before the West Penn Trolley Meet, we'll have a presentation kind of featuring the new book that PTM has published called Pittsburgh Streetcar City. And several of the folks involved in putting that book together will be presenting that. And the book will be available during the trolley meet as well. And thank you again to those of you who donated today. We really, really appreciate your support. You can join as a member or become a volunteer at patrolley.org/support. And yeah, we truly, truly appreciate it. So let me go ahead and let everyone unmute themselves. I think participants got a real kick out of your dad's time at NASA's predecessor and that aerial photography. That was a really cool story.
Yeah, rail fans are always pretty creative guys.
So everybody should be able to unmute themselves if you have a question or a comment. Lots of nice comments coming in through the chat. Does anybody have any questions for Rich?
I have a couple.
Go ahead, George.
All right. When you had the description when CTS procured the original 4200s back in 1946,
Yeah.
you mentioned the body width of 9 foot 4 inches, I believe it was.
8'4".
8'4". Okay, and it said for potential resale. What did that mean?
Yeah, so I think they were kind of McCarter, who was the general manager at the time, may have kind of known a little more than he let on to a lot of folks, that maybe the plan, the Reed McCarter plan, wasn't going to go forward. The city council may not have agreed to it. So he wanted to make sure he bought a fleet of cars that he could sell, CTS could sell and market very quickly. And having a wide Shaker, Chicago, and long Pcc car would have really limited the resale of those cars.
I see. So it's not a disrepute of the PCC itself, but of the policy of the Cleveland system more than that.
Yeah, absolutely. Because and again, Shaker was kind of upset about that because they were already looking at the purchase of PCCs and they wanted a wide car.
Okay.
Wide and long car like Chicago, and there's no reason why just about all the car lines could not have taken a bigger, wider, longer car. So,
well, it's ironic because when I researched the acquisition by Shaker Heights Rapid Transit in 1947, the next year,
yeah,
I was wondering how come they didn't make an effort to get the same cars that the CTS had, if nothing else, for standardization. I mean, just as a maintenance strategy, that's something you'd think about, okay? But they did not.
No,
SHRT wanted every car that they could get to be wide.
Yep.
Exactly the opposite of what CTPS was looking for.
Yeah, it's strange. Yeah, it's really strange that way. But they were really, the Shaker was really kind of a cross between a commuter operation.
Right. And that was why, as I understood later, that was why Shaker Heights made no effort to acquire the Cleveland PCC fleet when it first became available. I think in 1951 it was offered or something like that.
Yeah.
Because they were too small. They were seen as too small for what they do.
Absolutely. Yeah.
Okay.
They really loved their 2-2 seating, and they, even when I was working in the schedule department,
okay,
for RTA, they wanted to schedule for seated loads. Now they were standees, but you didn't exceed we weren't allowed to schedule Shaker like we scheduled CTS Rapid or a bus line. That wasn't going to fly because people just weren't going to put up with it.
Okay. Now, getting up to the Toronto era, the only notes I can add to you is when they had the MU operation, it lasted in Queen Street until I believe the last of it was early 1997, I think is when it actually ended. Okay. Like board, I don't know. I want to say November 1977, but I'm not sure. It could have been early in the year. My cousin was an operator with TTC, and that's why he took the job, was because he could sleep in the trailer car and open and close the doors. Okay.
Yeah, you could read the newspaper and directions. Yeah.
Anyway, so he got to know the different types of cars, and he wasn't familiar with them running in Cleveland, but he did know the 4600s. He called them A11 class and A12 class. Okay. Yeah. So anyway, what happened was they basically spun a whole bunch of them off when they discontinued the 2-car trains. Like I said, 76, 77, something like that. That's when they started to put them in storage and they were using the parts. So what basically RTA came in with desperation, TTC was more than happy to sell them what they had left for some Cleveland cars that, and they
Yeah,
didn't even really bother to inspect them or anything. They just basically told them,
Yeah.
okay, here you go.
It's funny because I was reading in Blaine Hayes's book that RTA actually paid more to get those cars back and CTS sold them to Toronto for, which is kind of amazing.
Yeah.
after all those years.
So I'm not even sure if all the 9 cars that RTA got actually ran. It could be. I can look it up, but I'm not going to bother right now. Okay.
Yeah, there were a couple that did not run.
Yeah.
They never got into service.
Okay. So the one that went to IRM, I also did like you. Well, I guess you worked on it. I did an inspection on it in August of 2019, and I did have a picture of what they took. It was basically the body. They were working on the trucks. I think they needed some control componentry and things like that. The Westinghouse componentry. It's still a bit of a ways for finishing, but it looks pretty good.
Yeah,
that's it for me.
I had a quick question, Rich. Fantastic presentation as always. My question was the MU equipment that was on the Cleveland streetcars, or the provisions for MU. Was that something that CTS was actually considering using in the future, or was it more like using a resale?
Yeah, the Reed McCarter plant that would have built the 100 block or so east-west subway and the new downtown subway. Their vision was to run an MU operation. That was core to the whole plan, was MU operation to increase capacity and lower the number of cars coming through the subway by MU and a lot of stuff. So it would have been interesting. You know, it's hard to say which plan was the right decision. I mean, I wish they would have stuck with streetcars. It would have been neat as a fan. But again, at the time, it was a big city, you know, and it was growing. And so had they implemented the full rapid transit plan, because they only implemented a small part of it, it probably would have worked quite well, but they only wound up with one line, you know. And there was just tremendous opposition. I see some chatter about in the comments here about Christensen, and you know, there was just a strong highway lobby at the time that just prevented the subway from ever getting off the ground and any other extensions ever being built. It's kind of sad.
Mr. Krisak, thank you for a wonderful presentation. Your father's photography is wonderful, and it has withstood the ages. I want to thank you for a great presentation on Cleveland.
I'm glad you enjoyed it.
Thank you. And Christian, I want to thank you for taking the time and trouble to organize this whole shebang.
Thanks for tuning in.
Raylon, it amazed me that Cleveland kept such a complicated paint scheme for so long. Usually, I'm familiar with Philadelphia. When the new cars came in, they were all fancy and different paint schemes, and then after they were repainted, that was the end of this and that was the end of that. But I was really sharp. I thought the cars were always sharp looking, and they kept that scheme
they were a fairly well
anyway.
maintained system. They maintained the streetcars fairly well to the end. You know.
Nice, good presentation.
Well, thank you.
Do we have other questions or comments for Rich?
A couple of points. The Washington, DC Transit paint scheme was even more complicated in Cleveland. It had an amazing design, must have cost a fortune, and they didn't repaint all the streetcars in DC. I guess they ran out of money. Harry Christensen, why did he hate streetcars? Why did he hate the Cleveland Rapid? Why did he say that Shaker Heights was going to have to be converted to busway because no one in the world made streetcars anymore? These are obviously lies. What motivated him?
I don't know. It's strange. It's strange. My dad was good friends with him, and I knew him. He was actually doing some work with RTA
Mhm.
when I was an intern. Was still kicking around the agency. Yeah, he was a streetcar fan. I mean, he went on all these fan tours with my dad and all these other guys. I'm sure Bill Vivers probably remembers him, the Cleveland guys. I don't know what turned him against streetcars. I don't get it. Not only was I mean he was very much against rapid transit and streetcars, but he actually towards the end kind of became against transit buses and everything in general, and was really enamored by freeways and his big thing was, well, downtown Cleveland is dead. Well, yeah, because you choked all the transportation and the investment. So over the years, what did you built all the freeways and you built all these suburban shopping malls outside the city. So it's kind of like, what did you expect was going to happen here after a while,
Awesome.
Well,
Carl Jackson here. Thank you, as always. Excellent presentation. Appreciate it.
well, thank you. I love your background.
Yeah. Car 1506 to be exact.
I got to get down there and ride that thing.
Yeah, we're having some propulsion system problems. Well, they are actually, since I'm retired, but I just talked to the maintenance supervisor and I'm trying to help him work some stuff through with ABB.
What was the name of the Cuyahoga County engineer? His name was L something, I believe.
Albert Porter.
Yes, Porter.
Albert S. Porter.
Yeah, so
he
they-
wrote,
Who
he wrote
hired
articles.
Harry?
He wrote articles condemning in strongest terms.
Oh yeah, and I see Jim Bragner. Jim, you were probably there when a lot of that stuff was going on.
Yeah, I knew Harry also, and he was a Closet Rail fan. But he worked for Bert Porter, so he couldn't very well say he lived a funny life that way.
Yeah, it was strange, before it was weird because before the first rapid transit line opened, they had already passed a referendum to approve bonding to build the subway. So even before the first rapid transit car ran, citizens were committed to, let's really make this thing work. And then he held off the issue of the bonds so long that the bond issue expired, and you would have to go back to the voters again to have another referendum to build the subway. He and Don Hyde took over from, I don't know whether you knew Don Hyde or not, Jim.
Yeah, I did.
John took over as general manager when McCarter left to eventually go to Chicago, and Don would get in these huge fights in like this the city club, Cleveland City Club, and all that with Porter and newspapers and media and everything about how critical the subway plan and rapid transit extensions were to the whole region. And Don Hyde remained committed to it to the day he left the system. He retired. It just unfortunately never happened.
And Leonard then finally hired Harry back, and stuffed him in the corner in a fairly minor position.
Yeah, that's when I knew him.
That was sort of when I guess Leonard figured Harry couldn't do a lot of harm if he was reporting to Leonard directly, which he was, and trying to write articles that weren't critical.
Yeah, I think
the horse was out of the barn by then.
Yeah, I think Ronis did that to kind of shut him up so he wouldn't write nasty anti-RTA articles.
By that time, they were
Comment
both a lot
on
older and a lot more tired.
Was Christensen against the end of streetcars or for it?
Who?
Cleveland. It's not
Oh,
apparent from his books. Was Harry Christensen opposed to the elimination of streetcars in Cleveland, or?
No, I don't think so. In fact, over the years, Harry takes credit for the rapid transit because he was a proponent of using the right-of-way that the vans built on the east side. The east side rapid transit right-of-way, a lot of it was already there. It was built when CUT was built. platforms. The catenary towers were even there. And Harry was kind of pushing that as the solution, to transit, to get rid of streetcars and go to this new modern rapid transit system. And we could do it really cheap, which is funny because you see a lot of new light rail systems kind of making somewhat of the same mistake. I know we did in Dallas, and I know San Diego did it to a degree. Following freight railroad right-of-ways is cheaper than building, subways and really getting the system into where the people really live, and you're betting on buses feeding, the line. And there's been some real successes of that for sure, but a lot of times I know some of the lines we built in Dallas would have been much better had we not gone down railroad freight right away and actually into the using other right away into the neighborhoods that we could have got into, but it would have been a lot more expensive. So
Could you comment on the new car orders for the Shaker and the Cleveland Rapid that was supposed to be the same car, and then the bidders didn't bid?
Yeah, that's what I've heard so far. There was some, well, actually they got some bids. What I heard was they got bids, but the bids were not in conformance with the bid preparation document submittal and all that. And so they decided to cancel it and put it back on the street, but I haven't heard whether it actually went back on the street again. So this order, the cars are supposed to be both low and high platform compatible, kind of like Pittsburgh has low door and high platform doors. I mean, Siemens builds a variant of the S70 that's now running in San Francisco that has both high and low level boarding. That probably would be ideal for Cleveland. So I don't know, we'll see. I mean, I hope they're still committed to keeping Shaker operational. I mean, the ridership is really pretty low. But I hope it stays around.
Rich, I have a question. What happened to that level of the bridge? I know you've answered that in like a previous presentation, but the streetcar subway.
Yeah, so they had a crazy idea of converting the lower level for buses and cars, but because of the column spacing and how tight it was, streetcar being on rail, pretty easy to steer around objects, and they had some pretty horrific collisions under the bridge with cars. They decided this is probably not a smart idea, so they closed off the lower deck. It's all still there. And they were giving tours. I don't know if they do it anymore or not, but they were actually giving bridge tours like once a year, where you could go down into the old streetcar subway stations. And they built a mock-up of a 1200 series Pullman center entrance car that the county built, carpenters. And I think there's also a front end clip of a CTS Bluebird rapid transit car down there, which is kind of weird because they would have never operated down there. But anyway, so I guess I don't know if they're still giving tours down there or not.
How many stations were on the bridge?
There was none on the east side. There were just 2 on the west side.
And the east side rather was filled in rather early, as I remember, because I worked for Gilman at the time, and our office was right above the old east side entrance. And that that got filled in real early.
Yeah, some articles I read, the bus congestion across the bridge when they shut the streetcar lines down was pretty heavy, and people were really complaining about it because it really screwed up traffic on the bridge. Because all the freeways back then were built, so people were still using a lot of arterials to get in and out of the city. And they actually wound up widening the bridge, putting a lane on one lane on either side of the bridge, cantilevering it years later to increase capacity because it got so heavy.
Thanks. Are there any further questions or comments for Rich or about his presentation? All right, hearing none, I want to thank everybody again for joining us tonight. Especially thank you to those who donated, and thank you so much to Rich for all the wonderful photos. I hope you'll come back and do another program for us in the future, because they're always so much fun and so well researched, and the personal stories are just awesome. So I hope you come back and do another one, and we will look forward to your article in sometime this year, hopefully. And again, thank you guys for joining us, and we'll see you at the next one. Have a great night.
Have a good
Good night.
evening, all.
Good night.
All right.
Be safe and
Good
healthy.
evening, everybody.